In the first video, we considered how both individuals and civilizations change over time according to the flow of shifting ideas that govern their thinking and actions. We saw how the gods of Mesopotamia spread outward into Canaan, Asia Minor, then Greece, and on to Rome. Jesus came into the world at the peak of the Roman Empire, which was beginning to decline for the same reason many civilizations have declined. However, Christianity spread, survived over 200 years of persecution, and was seen as sufficiently beneficial that 4th century emperors Constantine and Theodosius I legalized and favored Christianity in the hope that blending it with Roman culture might save the dying Roman Empire. The idea failed, and the Roman Empire fell anyway in 476 AD. From 400 to 1648, Christianized culture spread throughout Europe and came to be known as Christendom. However, as this was occurring, biblical supernaturalism gradually became pretty distorted. The Roman Church morphed into a Christianized Roman Empire, in which a political pontiff on a throne in Rome gradually morphed into a Christian pontiff on a throne in Rome. Wealth and power corrupted the papacy, increasingly taxing all of Europe. The Inquisition sought to enforce theological unity throughout Europe. The papal schism was an embarrassment to everyone. Internal Reformation efforts were stifled until exploding into 100 years of nasty Reformation warfare, followed by continuing hostility between Rome and the Reformers, and even hostility between Reformation groups. Well, by the time Reformation warfare ended in 1648, Christianity did not look very appealing because Christendom had become a colossal European mess. Within 50 years, secular-minded intellectuals were seriously thinking about saving European civilization from Christendom, because every nation in Europe had a political system closely aligned with either the Catholic Church or a local Reformation group. Secularists wanting to demolish Christendom had 3 tasks before them. First, they wanted to break the political power of church and state, the divine right monarchies, so they fostered political revolutions in France and Russia. Second, discredit the Bible's validity with hostile biblical criticism, since it was seen as the foundation for Roman Catholicism, divided Protestantism, and the divine right monarchies. Third, replace biblical ideas about nature and history with atheistic stories. Enlightenment nature stories were promoted as science and reason, but their imagined inherent evolutionary progress scenario was based on materialistic naturalism philosophy and evidence yet to be found in the future. Well, this project to demolish Christendom began with the French Enlightenment, which led to the French Revolution, then to the Napoleonic Wars, and later spread to other European intellectuals and continued in the larger modern era. The French Enlightenment ran from 1689 to 1789 AD, as the French economy was declining under a wealthy, self-absorbed divine right monarchy and untaxed church, both seemingly based on the Bible and Christianity. While reformers were trying to distinguish corrupted Christendom from biblical Christianity, many had enough of the church and embraced deism, which retains God as creator, but after creation God withdrew and now only natural processes are at work, with no interventions such as miracles or answered prayer. But the loudest and most persistent voices wanted to be done not only with church, organized religion, but also with the supernatural altogether, preferring a return to ancient Greek materialism and naturalism, in effect, atheism, a worldview in which only physical matter is real. They optimistically imagined that if the church and monarchy were gone, France would inherently evolve into an enlightened secular utopia of reason and science. So, for a century, They wrote anonymous articles attacking both church and monarchy while promoting atheism and anarchy. And after a harsh winter and food shortages in 1789, Paris exploded and the French Revolution began. The Bastille, a prison for political dissidents, was stormed. Clergy were harassed and killed, and churches were closed and turned into temples of reason. The king and queen were arrested and beheaded. Nobles were rounded up and brought to Paris for public executions. Revolutionary leaders tried and argued over various forms of government until they began sending each other to the guillotines. At that point, in 1799, a military leader named Napoleon Bonaparte took over, imposed order, and then gave France a new goal: conquering Europe. By 1815, the Russian winter and other military defeats ended Napoleon's vision of conquering Europe. But the French Enlightenment's hatred of what it saw as Christianity continued spreading amongst secular intellectuals in other countries: England, Germany, Austria, and Russia. As this movement grew, secular intellectuals targeted the universities so they could control the minds of future leaders for generations to come. The most effective assault on any fortress or institution is to take out the foundations, because then everything built on them will crumble from its own weight. There are a number of logical fallacies and devices of persuasion that can be used to discredit an existing viewpoint, focusing on and exaggerating only its flaws, while promoting your own alternative scenario as overwhelmingly better and ignoring its weaknesses and problems. Philosophers, politicians, lawyers, and advertisers have been using these tactics for centuries. The Enlightenment ridiculed the Judeo-Christian worldview as thoroughly corrupt and evil man-made tradition, while promoting its own atheistic evolutionary progress scenario as rational, scientific, supported with overwhelming evidence, and believed by all intelligent people.
Remember, whoever controls government, education, and the media wins, because we have the cultural microphone and control the discussion, the concepts, definitions, explanations, and what evidence is shared with the masses. We can demonize our critics, so continue to portray Christians as ignorant, evil, opposed to reason, evidence, and science.
Before Lyle Hutton, Darwin, T.H. Huxley, and others formulated the new orthodox nature stories for Earth history and life, a number of other European intellectuals were launching skeptical assertions at the biblical worldview, such as there's no evidence for the supernatural. Bible books were all written long after the events by unknown scribes. The Bible is full of contradictions, fiction, myths, and legends. These assertions accumulated to become a major assault on the credibility of the Bible, portraying it as a strictly man-made Jewish cultural production with little connection to reality and believed only by ignorant, superstitious people opposed to reason and science. Well, skeptics began with the Old Testament, and many earlier assertions were collected and finalized in the Groff-Wellhausen documentary hypothesis, first published in 1878, claiming the Torah, Genesis through Deuteronomy, was not compiled until the 5th century BC by dishonest Jewish scribes blending together ancient Canaanite, Mesopotamian myths and legends, and sources using two different names for God. All Old Testament books were written long after the traditional dates. There were no Jews in ancient Egypt, so the Joseph, Moses, and Exodus stories are false. Joshua and the conquest of Canaan did not happen, but was fiction invented by court poets to flatter later Jewish kings. Actually, rural Canaanites rebelled against urban rulers, invented a new god Yahweh, and became the Israelites. Hermann Hupfeld asserted that Moses could not have written the Torah during the 15th century BC because there were no written languages anywhere in the world at that time. The tabernacle and Solomon's temple never existed. Others joined in and expressed doubts about the existence of the cities in Genesis 10:10-12, the Hittites mentioned in Genesis, the dates for the kings of Israel and Judah, the Assyrian king Sargon mentioned in Isaiah 20, verse 1, David and Solomon, Belshazzar ruling Babylon when the Persians conquered it, and, of course, Jesus. The same paradigm was applied to the Gospels and the New Testament writings. The Gospels were not written by the traditional authors, but by unknown editors long afterwards, and synoptic theories suggested every imaginable variation of how Matthew, Mark, and Luke might have arisen from earlier sources, including a purely hypothetical collected Jesus sayings document. Secularism is just as prone to orthodoxy, dogma, and enforcing conformity with inquisitions as was the medieval Roman Church, so academics were, and continue to be, culturally pressured to assume atheism and then reason accordingly. Thus, hostile Bible criticism wrote itself, with logical suspicions flowing from atheistic assumptions. If there is no God, then there was no creation event or any real evidence for design in nature. No supernatural events, miracles, or interventions. No revelation. God did not speak to or give dreams to anybody. No inspired scripture. No predictive prophecy. All are ex eventu or written after the fact. In effect, history falsely portrayed as prediction. There are no cosmic moral values or boundaries, sin or righteousness, final judgment, heaven or hell, answered prayer, hope, meaning, and so on. Major Bible characters, events, cities, and nations are all questionable. Hostile biblical criticism's approach to the Bible was to deny, diminish, and discredit. And by the time they were done, the Bible appeared to be trashed. All events, places, people, and the documents themselves were made to appear thoroughly discredited or at least suspicious. The scholarly paradigm became, if in doubt, assume the Bible is wrong. However, the stuff that could be used against Christianity, papal corruption, the Crusades, the Inquisition, and Reformation warfare, were portrayed in the most negative way possible. The Crusades were presented as an unjustified assault on innocent, peace-loving Muslims in the Middle East, while Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code asserted that the medieval church murdered 5 million witches. Context and contrary facts are worthless in the minds of those with an imagined dogmatic agenda to promote. What Enlightenment advocates will not tell you is that Muslims invaded Europe centuries before the Crusades, and were nearing Paris, France, when turned back in 732 AD. And the best historical records indicate that a total of 30,000 witches were killed in Europe over several centuries, which is only 6% of Brown's wildly inflated number. Well, keep in mind that the foundations for this hack job on the Bible's credibility were essentially assembled and finished between 1700 and 1880, before anyone could actually enter the Islamic-controlled Middle East to investigate the biblical view of the ancient world. This would not even begin until after Napoleon's campaign in Egypt, 1798, and European powers were able to protect Jewish and Christian researchers. So, for the first 140 years, prior to that information being available, hostile skeptics could criticize the Bible freely, without fear of being refuted. Their views became well entrenched in European scholarly circles, and traditional inertia set in. Once the Enlightenment mindset attained orthodoxy status in secular academia, it was fashionable to automatically dismiss whatever the Bible said as wrong for lack of supporting evidence. However, on the other hand, Enlightenment stories like Darwinism equally lacking in supporting evidence, were assumed to be true and beyond question. Evidence contradicting Enlightenment stories tended to be minimized or ignored. Religious liberalism refers to Christian denominations that no longer take the supernatural or the Bible seriously because of leaders that were simply suckered by hostile biblical criticism and the new philosophical nature and history stories. Modern science, as following evidence or inductive empiricism, was well underway before the French Enlightenment. But the Enlightenment wanted to contradict the biblical worldview, so it looks like they identified major biblical ideas about nature, imagined opposite ideas, and then promoted these as scientific fact. The universe and the earth created in 6 days?
No, the universe evolved over billions of years.
The early earth covered with water?
No, the early earth was covered with molten magma. There was no water for millions of years.
Phyla appeared fully formed about the same time?
No, the major groups of life forms evolved gradually from protozoa.
Humans created from dust in God's image?
No, humans evolved gradually from the apes or an ape-like common ancestor.
Humans appeared language and technology capable?
No, language and technology are recent.
Nature under a curse of decay and decline?
No, there is a tendency for inherent progress within natural processes.
An ancient catastrophic flood of water?
No, there were no catastrophic events in Earth history, only uniform gradualism.
As with Greek skeptics in the 6th century BC, these new stories were based more on philosophy, materialism, naturalism, and deep time than evidence. Everything was imagined and assumed to have gradually evolved from early simple primitive forms into later complex advanced forms. Laplace and Kant suggested the nebular hypothesis to assert that galaxies, solar systems, and planets had slowly formed from cooling and condensing gas clouds over deep time. Hutton and Lyell imagined Earth history in terms of slow and gradual non-catastrophic processes operating over deep time. Charles Darwin assumed Hutton and Lyell's view of Earth history was correct and then imagined simple life arising from a few chemical reactions after which beneficial minor variations slowly accumulated to produce transformation, a gradually branching tree of life growing over deep time. Human history followed Darwin's story, assuming that an ape-like common ancestor had very slowly become a man-like ape, then an ape-like man, early man, and finally modern man, with language, technology, and architecture only arising within the last few thousand years. Evidence of technology appearing too early was dismissed as things left behind by intelligent aliens visiting the planet, and its ignorant, superstitious early humans thinking they were gods. The Demolish Christendom movement accomplished a masterful smear campaign and successfully moved Western civilization from the Judeo-Christian worldview to an alleged enlightened secularism, in which God is no longer considered a valid element of reality. The impression had been successfully created that the Bible had been discredited, and the imaginary evolution, nature, and history stories were true. This was what the U.S. Supreme Court cases from 1962 onward were expressing, removing the apparently discredited biblical worldview and replacing it by promoting and protecting the now sanctified secular evolutionary nature stories in the public sector. Christendom was a historical and cultural distortion that deserved to fall, but the Bible and biblical worldview is a very different matter. In the decades after 1800, As researchers were increasingly able to investigate the ancient Middle East, archaeological evidence began to suggest that the Bible was giving us a very credible picture of the ancient world, even from its earliest chapters. Human civilization, technology, and written languages go back a long way. Ancient people were not dimwits slowly evolving out of animal origins. Civilizations did suddenly appear in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus River valleys around 3000 BC. They knew of each other and believed that they were the descendants of people from a divine creation event. Their ancestors had lived longer lives, and earlier civilization was destroyed in a flood survived by a few people in a boat or on a mountain. The ancient cities mentioned in Genesis 10 through 12, were found and excavated. The Hittites mentioned in Genesis 15:20 and 23:10 were a major civilization in Asia Minor, and the capital city has been excavated. The Assyrian king Sargon, mentioned in Isaiah 20 verse 1, did live, and his palace excavated. Evidence has been found confirming the existence of Kings David and Solomon. The dates for the reigns of the Hebrew kings have been explained and were accurate. Belshazzar did rule the city of Babylon when the Persians conquered it, in Daniel 5:1. 53 biblical characters have been confirmed archaeologically. The Bible, written by Jews except for Luke in the book of Acts, does not look like a poorly crafted pseudo-history and collected myths to glorify the Jewish people. If that's what it was, the Old Testament would not portray the Jews as continually rebellious and even record the failures and sins of its greatest heroes. Jesus appeared on the stage of history. External records indicate that he existed and interacted with a Roman governor. His resurrected living body was seen by over 500 people, and those promoting the gospel early did not materially benefit from the story, but sacrificed much to tell what they had seen, heard, and were in a position to know if it was true or false. Since the mid-1800s, the Bible has been largely vindicated by archaeology as valid history. In 1944, the noted historian Will Durant admitted that hostile higher biblical criticism had applied tests to the New Testament so severe that hundreds of accepted ancient people would be dismissed as legends. In 1963, William F. Albright noted the fashion of treating early material in the Bible as Jewish pseudo-history, but that rapidly accumulating data supports the early patriarchal traditions as history. In 1981, the German science writer Werner Keller echoed that assessment, noting that what was once dismissed as pious tales must now be judged as real history. Enlightenment secularists wanted to demolish the Bible altogether, but the accumulating evidence looks like the Bible is right, after all. In 1993, Clifford Wilson, director of the Australian Institute of Archaeology, said that archaeological evidence now supports the Bible as history back to the early chapters of Genesis. Increasingly, the biblical record looks like authentic history. Accumulating observations and evidence have increasingly supported things the Bible says about nature and origins, while raising doubts about many of the materialistic nature stories that were devised to contradict what the Bible says. Is the universe and nature a cosmic accident or something designed? Noted physicist and astronomer Arno Penzias said the origin of the universe is exactly what he would have predicted if all he had to go on was the Bible. The famous atheist Richard Dawkins has admitted that biology is the study of complicated things that appear to have been designed for a purpose. Enlightenment atheists wanted to replace the eternal creator with an eternal universe of eternal matter. but observations eventually pointed towards the universe and Earth having a beginning. And all elements of nature did not form slowly over deep time, but could have occurred a lot faster than that, like the moon forming in a couple hours. It looks like Genesis 1, 6 through 10 might have been correct after all. The early Earth was covered with, or did have a lot of water at the beginning. It appears that Genesis 2, 5 and 6 correctly describes the pre-flood world as having a universal tropical climate. The North Pole, the Arctic, was once tropical. The South Pole, Antarctica, was tropical. And both polar regions had palm trees and lush forests in an ancient hothouse climate. Enlightenment secularists imagined an inherently improving natural order before the recognition of the second principle of thermodynamics. Now it is known that the natural order is declining and winding down. The universe is slowly dying. To eliminate the biblical flood, James Hutton and Charles Lyell, a medical doctor and a lawyer, portrayed Earth history in terms of gradual uniform change, with no catastrophic events, and this was popularized to promote the Enlightenment scenario. However, more knowledgeable experts were not impressed with this story, for they were well aware that major catastrophic events have occurred in Earth history. Huge floods, tsunamis, earthquakes, landslides, and so on, and they make major changes to the landscape in a short time. Leading evolutionists between 1863 and 1954 imagined that early life was very simple and arose from inanimate matter by nothing more than a few simple chemical reactions in a warm little pond or in ocean floor slime. But that was never anything more than materialistic wishful thinking. The more honest folks in the scientific community have been quietly admitting for decades that the jump from inanimate matter to a living cell is one of fantastic dimensions, all conjecture and no scientific evidence. Darwin's warm little pond scenario was simply imagined as a materialistic fairy tale, unsupported by any evidence. Scientists don't really know how life originated on this planet and are in substantial ignorance. Geologists, chemists, astronomers, and biologists are as stumped as ever by the riddle of life. In 1954, George Wald wrote an article on the origin of life in which he admitted that the spontaneous generation notion of life arising out of inanimate matter has been scientifically disproven and is impossible. But to avoid the biblical idea of special creation, he was going to believe in spontaneous generation anyway. Fossils have never looked like Darwin's story of a gradually branching tree of life. Darwin admitted that and expressed his concern in The Origin of Species, Chapter 9. In the 1920s, Harvard-trained biologist and curator at the U.S. National Museum, Austin H. Clark, said plainly that the fossils look like all of the major groups appeared fully formed and at about the same time, as Genesis 1, 20-25 describes. There is no evidence that any of the major groups arose from any other. Genesis 1:26-28 and chapter 5, verse 2 portray humans as a special creation that did not arise from some ape-like ancestor. In 1871, Charles Darwin published The Descent of Man, asserting that humans gradually evolved from an ape-like common ancestor. So secularists have imagined a trail from apes to man and promoted that notion with artwork. However, since the 1960s, the more honest experts have admitted that very little supporting evidence has accumulated and have only made the story more murky. In 1968, F. Clark Howell admitted that Darwin published his story about humans arising from the apes without a single subhuman fossil as evidence to support his theory. In 1977, Time magazine ran a story in which they admitted continuing doubts about the sequence of man's emergence. The theories are based on embarrassingly few fossil fragments. Huge gaps exist in the fossil record, and the picture of man's origin is far from complete. In 1984, Mary Leakey, the wife of Louis Leakey and Richard Leakey's mother, admitted that we know very little about man's origin, and that she no longer believed it was possible to arrange hominid fossils into a reliable pattern. In 1995, Richard Lewontin stated that no fossil hominid could be established as our direct ancestor. In 2007, John Noble Wilford admitted that what is missing are the fossils to document when and how humans emerged. In 2016, Kate Wong wrote that fossils thought to be human ancestors had generally been so few that they could fit in a desk drawer. Some sections are completely unknown, and others based on evidence so scanty that it is little more than speculation. In 2021, the American Museum of Natural History admitted that most human origin stories are not compatible with available evidence. The narrative for human origins is just a big mess. An amazing amount of evidence has accumulated that indicates the earliest languages were the most complex, and earlier humans were capable of sophisticated technology. The Enlightenment had good reasons to reject what it saw in Christendom, but it was wrong about two things. First, archaeology would eventually demonstrate that the Bible is valid history. Second, their evolutionary progress nature stories were based on philosophy, overly optimistic faith in evidence yet to be found, and a measure of ignorance about how nature really functions. The belief in simple early life between 1863 and 1953 was based in ignorance of cellular complexity and the intricate coding that drives cellular processes, DNA. Darwin knew that fossils did not look like his gradually branching tree of life story, and he imagined unlimited variation producing transformation because he was ignorant of genetics, having published The Origin of Species by Natural Selection 7 years before Mendel's work was published. I find some comfort in the growing number of well-educated defectors from the Enlightenment camp who have seen enough to go against the grain and speak out. These 5 are a small sampling. John A.T. Robinson was a noted liberal Bible critic who reconsidered and concluded that the Gospels and New Testament letters are authentic and early, written by the traditional authors. Antony Flew was a famous English atheist who returned to a creator because of reason and evidence. Etta Linnemann, a German critical scholar who turned her back on biblical criticism as biased, hostile philosophy. Thomas Nagel, an atheist philosophy professor who saw validity in intelligent design questions that he did not think deserved to be ridiculed and ignored. And Neil Thomas, a noted British agnostic who rejected Darwinism in favor of intelligent design. If you want to further investigate the validity of the biblical view of nature and history, and the weaknesses of the Enlightenment stories, then see my other videos. As it was proper for 18th and 19th century European secularists to look at the fruits of Christendom from 900 to 1700 AD, so is it equally proper for 21st century Christians to consider the fruits of secularism in modern Western civilization between 1700 and 2000 AD. What has Enlightenment and modern-era secularism given to Western civilization over the previous 300 years? Where is the secular paradise we were promised if the Christian religion was eradicated? Has everything promoted by progressives really turned out to be progress and an improvement on the past? Materialism and naturalism are the philosophical foundations for both Marxist-Leninist communism and Nazism, or German National Socialism. Socialism sounds so noble when being promoted. Everybody will be equal, and Russia advertised a workers' paradise. But the reality is that there is still a privileged upper class, the party, and everyone else. Officially, everyone is equal, but some are more equal than others. Nothing admits failure like the Berlin Wall that encircled Soviet-controlled East Berlin so that Germans could not flee communist control. Why would anyone want to flee a workers' paradise unless it was not what was advertised? Look at Russia, China, and North Korea. Historically, idealistic socialism usually turns into oppressive communism, with secret police, re-education camps, information tightly controlled, party line propaganda that everyone must agree with, and people risking their lives to escape. Things go sour when people realize that they're expected to work hard and the state takes it all away and redistributes it to everyone else, especially to party members and the military. During their many 5-year plans, Russia allowed a few capitalist farms to operate for comparison, where farmers had a quota to produce, and anything beyond was theirs to keep. The capitalist farms outproduced the socialist farms by a considerable margin. Why innovate or work harder if the state takes everything? Capitalism can be corrupt, unprincipled, and ruthless in the hands of some individuals, but communism can also do that on a national level. Nobody talks about freedom in communist countries except to yearn for it. The ideological foundations of communism is Enlightenment materialism and naturalism. Materialism and naturalism are atheistic philosophies, and communism is officially atheistic. So biblical Christianity has had to go underground to operate. When society officially jettisons the supernatural, the cosmic moral order disappears, and then right and wrong, or morality, declines into individual and situational ethics. Historian Will Durant noted that in 6,000 years of human history, no society has ever maintained a consistent and workable moral system without belief in the supernatural. For there to be a workable fixed morality, there must be a recognized source of morality that is higher than the individuals, God, who also will hold humans accountable for their bad behavior, judgment. And the amazing thing is that during the Enlightenment, while a number of French intellectuals were pushing for atheism, many of them realized that God was necessary for morality to work. When there is no higher source for a fixed morality and accountability, then each individual's idea of right and wrong becomes just as authoritative as anyone else's, and morality quickly devolves into everyone doing their own thing. If there is no God, everything is permitted. In the United States of the 1960s, the Supreme Court began removing the Bible and Christianity from the public sector, and do your own thing became the cultural ideal. We began hearing about situational ethics and the new morality, which was nothing more than a relabeling of the old immorality. Free love led to abortion on demand, easy divorce, then cultural approval of homosexuality, followed by promotion of transgenderism. Divorce numbers declined because many no longer even bothered to get married. Well, now we see riots justified for all sorts of alleged past injustices, with professional agitators and demonstrators paid and bussed into local events with pre-printed signs and flags provided to those who often cannot explain to journalists why they're there. Those who murder corporate executives and international terrorists become heroes on American college campuses while their crimes are ignored. One political party in particular openly jettisoned God from their national party platform, then moved to using bogus lawsuits and the obliging media to continually harass their opponent with assertions of wrongdoing that were never proven. When facts, truth, and accountability are abandoned, corruption comes storming into politics, the legal system, advertising, education, and even scientific research. Historian Arnold Toynbee noticed that of the 20 or so civilizations that have gone through a similar rise and fall progression, they tend to expand, grow, and succeed when the supernatural is embraced. They plateau as the supernatural is doubted as archaic and inhibiting freedom, and then decline when the supernatural is rejected, virtue is ridiculed, and commonly held moral and ethical values are abandoned for ruthless individualism. Worldviews are not all equally true and valid. People do operate on the basis of what they are taught and believe about reality. However, change is not always progress, and those who call themselves progressives are not always promoting things that are actually good or better for civilization. Old is not always inferior, and new is not always better. I grew up respecting the Bible, but believing the Enlightenment nature and history stories. I heard them in school and at home, for my dad was a Darwinian biology department head at a state college in Michigan. In my mid-20s, I was challenged by a friend to seriously reconsider those stories and the Bible. I eventually chose biblical theism and increasingly doubted the Enlightenment stories. This did not occur because I abandoned reason, evidence, and science, but because I finally started taking those things seriously.